Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Cafe. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of the series. Monica Dragos and I co-created this program. Today, Monica will be in conversation with Dr. Patricia Hasbach about her new book, Prescribing Nature, a Clinician's Guide to Ecotherapy, just published yesterday, so it's hot off the press. A pioneer in the practice of ecotherapy, Dr. Hasbach has a licensed psychotherapist, consultant, author, and college educator. In private practice for 3 decades, she offers traditional therapy and ecotherapy to adults, couples, families, and groups. She consults with hospitals, schools, businesses, correctional facilities, and community groups. She is the former co-director of the Ecopsychology Certificate Program in the Graduate School of Education and Counseling at Lewis and Clark College, where she taught for 13 years. Patricia sits on the editorial board of the peer-reviewed journal Ecopsychology, and I will send a link in the email to all the wonderful documents books that she's written. But for now, Monica, I'm going to turn it over to you to start the conversation. Thank you, Patricia, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks, Carol. I'm Monica Dragos, and I'm in southeastern British Columbia near the headwaters of the Columbia River. And today we're talking to Patricia about her book, Prescribing Nature. And Patricia, I'm aware this is your second book about ecotherapy, if I'm correct.
I wrote a book in 2012 with a colleague at UW that was on ecopsychology, and that's where I explored ecotherapy kind of for the first time in a chapter that I had written in there. And then last in 2023, I did a book for the general public kind of wrote it during the pandemic of looking at, it was called Grounded, and it was a guided journal that really was designed to help people look at various ways to bring more nature into their lives.
That's great. And so would you say that who is this book for then? Who's the intended audience for this book?
This book was really designed for mental health practitioners, social workers, counselors, psychologists who have an interest in bringing more nature into the therapeutic work they do. And I also found that there's a lot of pediatricians and family practice physicians who are really looking at the impacts of connection with nature for folks, particularly for kids. And so the book was really geared with that lens to people who would be providing therapeutic work in either the healthcare setting or the mental health care setting, who want to bring more nature into the work. You know, traditionally, our work has been in office spaces and generally on issues that stop at the urban boundary. And as most of your listeners know, and certainly the other people hosting this webinar know, that we haven't really addressed the human-nature relationship. And that's what this book hopes to do.
Hmm. So in the book, you talk about broadening the lens of therapy to include the natural world. And you just spoke a bit about that in answering the first question, but can you elaborate a little bit about what that means to broaden the lens? And you mentioned like the going past the urban boundary.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for the question. Um, when we think about how the lens that the therapist uses when we're sitting with a client, in trying to understand them as wholly as we can and understand the issues as deeply as we can, we generally can think about all the spaces where therapeutic work can focus on. And one of those analogies that I like to think about when I was teaching was looking at the therapist lens, sort of like a camera lens. And we open and broaden view of the patient or the client with each kind of stop. So initially, we might look at what's happening internally with the person, the intrapsychic issues that are happening, that are affecting their lives. And then we might look at the interpersonal relationships that the person's engaged in. And then we might open that a little bit broader and look at the family systems that have impacted the person, their family of origin, and perhaps the current family that they're living in. And then we can open that lens a little further and look at the societal or cultural impacts on the person. And that would include things like sexism and racism and ageism and education issues and things that have impacted a person's life. And traditionally, therapy has kind of stopped in terms of our lens there. And with ecotherapy, we kind of open that one stop further and look at the relationship the person has in the ecological system that they're in, the relationship they have with the natural world or not, what impacts them that way. So that's what I mean. And I think it's especially important to broaden that lens for a couple of reasons. We've got really good data now from research that has just exploded in the last decade about the impacts and the importance of interacting with the natural world for our health and well-being. So we know that it can lower stress. We know that interacting with nature can reduce some of the ruminations of depression, those negative thoughts that keep us in those loops. It can lessen anxiety. It can reduce ADHD symptoms. And it can also foster things like creativity and encouraging us to move and be healthy physically, encourage and heighten our cognitive function, increase our sense of happiness. There's lots of reasons that make addressing that human nature relationship a best practice now. Something we knew intuitively, we've now got the research that backs that up. And in the book, I tried to connect some of the research work as I was talking about these various things so that clinicians sitting in their office who probably have limited time and not a lot of time to go out and search for the research in multiple journals and so forth, have at least a little bit of a condensed version of what's backing up some of these practices that we're suggesting. Um, and I think the other reason that's important that clinicians expand the lens with which they're working with people is that we're seeing more and more people coming in with concerns about what's happening in the environment and some of the climate change impacts that they may have experienced directly from climate-related disaster like floods or wildfires or hurricanes, and the sort of chronic stress that people are experiencing around eco-anxiety and what's happening with the future, particularly with young people. So that's why I think it's very timely that we look at expanding that lens to include the relationship that humans have with the natural world that we're part of.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think one of the gifts of the book is, amongst others, is that you did condense the research. So thank you for that, because I do think it serves as a guide for people to refer to kind of back up why we would do this too. So nature can be described in many different ways, such as domestic nature, wild nature, and the more than human world. I'm wondering what your definition, how you define nature, and why it is essential for a therapist and client to consider, I guess, the nature continuum.
When I was first starting the book, I wanted to kind of clarify how I was defining nature kind of at the beginning of the book. And it was a bit of an eye-opener when I started to just look at various dictionary definitions of nature. And there really appeared to be some confusion about whether humans were included in nature. And some dictionaries did include it, others did not include humans as part of nature. And as I thought about it, I thought this duality of humans not being part of nature was kind of at the heart of the problems that we are facing, um, that separates humans from the natural world, or this disconnection that people have from the natural world. So the way I defined nature for the book was nature included all of the physical world, including humans. It included all of the physical world um, that exist that is not human built. Now, there's lots and lots of different ways to define nature. So I'm sure there'll be people that, might disagree with that. But because we can say that some of the things we utilize to build structures and build some of the things come from nature, and that's all true. But to make a workable definition, that's how I defined it. It was all that is living in the world, everything's in the physical world, including humans, the things that are not human built. The continuum of nature, I think, is important to think about because sometimes when I talk to therapists who are kind of like they're just kind of dipping their toe in interest in doing therapy, ecotherapy, they get concerned about, well, does this mean I have to go out and, hike with my clients? Does this mean I have to do overnights with my clients, that kind of thing? And I try to, um, in the book, I really tried to look at what can mainstream clinicians do who are sitting in offices, private practice, in hospitals, in schools, in agencies. What can they do to bring more nature into the work that they're doing? And this idea of a continuum of nature, I think, is important. That there is the wild nature, which would be the vast mountains and the deep oceans, and might entail with going out and exploring those with someone. And it goes all the way to more domestic versions of nature. So it could be the urban park that we take a walk in, or it could be our backyard garden that we suggest they go to in a nature prescription. Um, but I really make the assumption and have found in my practice that therapeutic work can happen in all of that continuum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Um, I recognize many concepts from various psychology fields, such as stress reduction theory, attention restoration theory, and biophilic design. Can you talk about ecotherapy being at the intersection of ecopsychology, conservation psychology, and environmental psychology?
Yeah. Um, I think that we have in the development of the field, in my experience, is we've often used the term ecopsychology and ecotherapy almost interchangeably. And I think as things have kind of developed and shaken out, it's become clearer that we need to make a distinction between the two, that ecopsychology really offers the theory foundation for the practices and methods that we use in ecotherapy. And generally, we find that most mental health clinicians work from a strong foundation of theories. It could be family systems theory, cognitive behavioral theory, relationship theory, acceptance theory. But we generally have a foundation that we work from when we're developing the practices or the methods that we're going to be using with our clients. And ecopsychology is providing that foundational piece for the practices of ecotherapy. And then there are these two other sort of fields of psychology, conservation psychology and environmental psychology, that I think really help us as well in developing the practices that we can use as ecotherapists. So, environmental psychology is really looking at all the theories around all different kinds of environments. It could be the natural environment, the built environment, informational environment, learning environments, healthcare environments. Um, we look at that and say, well, how might that influence um, the work that we're doing with our clients? Similarly, conservation psychology really looks at um, what are behaviors that we want to encourage that might be more pro-environmental behaviors, and what are ways to do that. So the intersection of all three of those areas, I think, form a strong theoretical base for the practicing clinician as they're developing their methods and their work. I think that's about all I could say about that one.
Sounds good. Yeah. Um, you discuss nature prescriptions and therapeutic nature language. I'm wondering if you have some examples. And then I guess a question related to this is, do you have some sense that ecotherapy needs to be standardized, or is that something that you're wanting to see?
Um, that's a big question. Those are big questions. So let's start with the idea of what is what is a nature prescription, um, and it's common practice for most clinicians, I think, today that will uh, maybe assign homework assignments to a client to extend the session hour, or ask them to reflect on something or work on something that they bring into therapy, and then bring that back in the next session. And a nature-based homework assignment is basically what a nature prescription is. Um, it's asking people to interact with some elements of the natural world, and really looking to understand what is most potent for the issue that they're working on. So, for example, in the book, I write about a situation where I was working with someone who was ending a very difficult relationship, and was having a very hard time ending it. And I also knew that she was a very good amateur photographer. And she had shared with me she was going on a trip, and she was looking forward to taking photographs of some mountains. So I asked her if she would think about taking some photographs um, at sunset, and asked her to perhaps journal about that experience, because I knew that she kept a journal pretty regularly. And my hope was that the natural piece of the closing of the day, the closing of what we, in the nature language area, we would call it the sort of the cycle of the periodicity of nature, or the cycle of nature that happens to close that time. And that might help us in looking at this analogy of closing this relationship. And she came back a couple weeks later with the photographs, and it was really interesting because my thought was I was going to ask her to photograph something another time at sunrise with a new beginning. And she came back and had already done that. Like intuitively, that worked for her to say, this closing was important to me because what I saw was the beauty when the sun went down below the horizon, and this afterglow that she described. of being something really special. And she thought it just was a natural thing for me to want to do, to look at the sunrise. So that's a kind of a very specific example that I write about that um, incorporates this idea of the impact that nature prescriptions can have outside of the therapy room. Now, I mentioned this sort of periodicity of nature or cycles of nature, and that's where the second part of your question comes in, is this idea of therapeutic nature language. And that could be a whole program all by itself, but I can say just briefly, when we think about nature language, it's looking at interaction patterns that we have with natural elements in the natural world. So in that case, it was the sun going down, and again, just intuitively, the sun coming back up for her. And I used that analogy with the closing of a relationship and the opening of a new beginning. When you think about what are some of these interactions that are just part of our lives that sometimes we don't even think of, they're so primal, they're so deep, they're just part of who we are, and they're very, very impactful. So some other examples can be sitting by fire, caring for another being, um, building a shelter. These are all examples of interaction patterns that can be really impactful when we include them in either the suggestions that we're giving someone for a nature prescription, or something that we do with someone when we go out, if we take for outdoors with a client. And I guess I want to say it's also important to recognize that some of these things can happen in very domestic settings. So the example of sitting by fire, we might think about sitting, a wild manifestation of that interaction pattern might be sitting around a campfire outdoors at night with others or alone. But a more domestic version of that might be sitting by a propane fire in our backyard, or even sitting by a fireplace in our family room. You know, these are experiences that develop during our human evolution embedded in the natural world. So they're deeply impactful if we work with them, very strategically. And I think we can listen to what our clients are sharing with us in terms of what interaction patterns are happening in their lives already, and build on that just by listening to their stories or the questions that we ask at intake. When we, again, right at the beginning, bring in the natural world into the therapeutic process, we get a lot of information that way. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, and thanks for the example. And I think you speaking about that highlights how creative I think ecotherapy needs to be. And I'm sort of guessing that as far as the part of the question about standardization, that doesn't
Yeah.
yeah, I'm wondering if those two things line up in your world or
Right. No, I would not say we want to limit our creativity at all. If anything, we're heightening the creativity of what we're doing. And it's really um, drawing on our deep listening and our deep grounding in these theories of our evolutionary psychology and eco-psychology. And again, the built environment and our relationship with the natural environment. So, what I do think is important that we look at is that eco-psychology and the human nature relationship needs to be part of our training. Traditionally, they are not part of training, and we're still working at that. But in terms of any standardization, I do think that would be the closest I would come to talking about standardizing things, is having it as part of our training models that we're offering to to graduate students.
Mm, thanks for that. Yeah. Mhm. Okay. Your book, I think rightly so, identifies our ethical responsibilities to nature. Why is this important to the therapeutic process? And do you have some practical examples of that, how you work that in?
Um, yeah. In the book, I've looked and addressed some of the logistical challenges of incorporating nature in the work, particularly when we move outdoors together. And then really highlighted the various professional codes of ethics for psychologists and social workers and counselors, and how we can look at what our professional organizations' codes of ethics say about things like confidentiality and competency and doing no harm. Um, but we don't have anything in our codes of ethics about our relationship or our ethical responsibility to nature. And I think if we're bringing nature into the process of therapy as a partner, we have to look at what ethical responsibilities do we have. Um, and again, I think it's particularly important when we're moving outdoors with clients. So I think there's various ways to model that as a clinician, whether we're working with an individual or working with a group. But partly is noticing how we're treating our environment around us, leaving no trace if we're out into the world. Um, I in my office practice there, I'm able to kind of move from the office right onto a walking path and bike path that runs behind my office building, and it leads over to a urban park. And it was modeling something like just picking up some pieces of trash that are as we're walking along, and stuffing it in a pocket to throw away later. Um, some people will also think about acknowledging the land that we're working on with people and the original peoples of that land. Similarly, we can thank nature if we're sitting under a tree and kind of enjoying its shade, or someone is sharing that it feels good to sit against this tree and uh, the strength that it offers that person. Taking a moment to just thank that element of the natural world. Um, I think those are a very sort of micro ethical choices and behaviors we can do. I think on a larger level, a larger macro level, as clinicians, we can use our voice in our communities to look at things like uh, encouraging community leaders, encouraging um, educators, to look at some of the climate change issues that are there, and looking at resilience pieces that we're not only working with individuals with, but communities with, or preparedness issues. And these are all ways I think we're um, acknowledging the power of nature and the need to protect it.
Yeah, thank you. In your opinion, what are, I guess, some of the future directions for ecotherapy?
Um, I think we've all seen such growth in the field in the last couple of decades, and thanks to Carol and Linda and people who were real pioneers in this work, have offered so much. And I think looking at where do we go from here? So I mentioned one of those things is really looking at um, partnering with other healthcare providers, whether it's pediatricians or family physicians or health educators, really partnering with some other providers outside of our field can be really impactful. Looking at using our voice and our skills in community issues that come up around climate change or around preparedness and community resilience that I mentioned earlier. I think collaborating with researchers. We used to have these sort of silos, and I think there's a much greater sharing of information from the researchers and then the clinicians putting some of these things into practice and feeding back to researchers. So kind of moving out of some of those silos that we're in and collaborating in that way. I mentioned new training models. I do think that that's a really important area that we can explore, and there's a lot of room for growth with that. And advocating for continued funding for research in areas that impact the human and nature relationship. I think we have so much research that demonstrates the sort of efficacy of ecotherapeutic practices now. And having that research behind us, I think helps us make a stand that ecotherapy is in fact a best practice to stand alongside other practices that we draw on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right on. That sounds good. I think we can start to open it up to questions from people, whether they want to drop it in the chat or pop on. But maybe as people are gathering their thoughts about that, I'll ask another question or one more. I'm curious, Patricia, about you mentioned a couple that you worked with in the book that got involved in a restoration project and how that impacted their relationship. And so I'm just curious, I think it piggybacks a bit on what we were just talking about in terms of the reciprocity piece. How did that conversation come about, or how did that idea come about in the therapy room to have them involved in that? Curious. Yeah.
Yeah, that was such an interesting situation. Couples work is always a bit challenging, and I knew that both of these people, from just what they shared again at intake and talking about their lives together, had for many years, and particularly in the early part of their relationship, been very outdoor, active people. And like so often can happen, life gets really busy, and um, professions and houses and children and all of those kinds of things start to um, kind of impinge on the time that they could have to do some things like that. And this particular couple had just kind of grown apart, and they were really looking at um, what do we still have in common besides the kids. And they were very proactive in wanting to do some things to reinvigorate their relationship. And we did a number of different nature prescriptions, mostly. I think I only went out with them once, but mostly we did nature prescriptions where I was encouraging them to take some time that they would engage in. They used to bike ride, doing some of that together, sitting and just talking with each other, touching each other, holding hands, embracing, just being together again in nature, even if it's just a walk around the neighborhood. And one of the things that I try to do is just stay aware of what are some of the things that are happening in the local community that I can use as a nature prescription in working with folks. And I'm in Oregon, and we in 2020 had some really severe wildfires go through here. And I live in the Mackenzie Valley, and this was very badly burned in this area. During that time, 173,000 acres burned up here. And we have a number of organizations that were looking at planting new trees, and we have a community organization called the Mackenzie River Trust, where they are really looking at using this opportunity to reinvigorate the landscape for the river. We have salmon here, steelhead here, and kind of restore the river back to its original footprint. So they often have ongoing programs that people can come and volunteer for on a weekly basis. And so I brought this to the attention of this particular couple to say, how likely is this you might be interested in working on this? And they really kind of jumped at it. It worked at a time in their schedule. And they started to volunteer on a weekly basis, working with this small group of volunteers in a particular part of the river. And they would come back with stories about, what happened during those times and who were some of the other people that they met. It just seemed to be such a connector that harkened back to how they connected in an earlier time in their relationship.
Yeah, that's so great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, it's nice to see.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So, do other folks have questions that are ready to go in the chat, or do you want to stick up your hand? Linda.
Oh, I just want to thank you so much for writing this book. We've really needed it. And I want to get your thoughts on how can this book help us make inroads into our professional associations, our training programs, all of which have been kind of dragging their feet. We haven't had good guidance for new therapists on how to do all of this. Do you have thoughts about how we can make some change?
Oh, that's a big question, Linda, and I appreciate it. And thank you so much for being here. I'm just thrilled that you're here. And um, I do think that as we look at, I guess my hope was that the book would provide sort of a launching point or a basis to be able to bring together some of the research and some of the practices that would be doable for the mainstream therapist. And I think the timing is good because as we're experiencing more people, particularly young people, coming in with concerns about the environment, concerns about their future, the topic is more mainstream today, and a little less polarizing, hopefully, for a greater numbers of people. That we'll see a rejuvenation in psychology programs to want to expand and include our relationship with the natural world. I'm really hoping that this book is one that could be used in teaching graduate students. And it's it's a hard piece. I do see. I'm most familiar with the American Psychological Association, and their Division 34 has been very active in trying to keep um, the human-nature relationship alive in terms of recognizing that, number one, there is a relationship. Often it's looking at environmental psychology and conservation psychology, but ecopsychology has stayed on that radar as well. So I think taking these kinds of pieces, whether it's a book or somebody's research or somebody's paper, and being willing to take it into those forums and present that in the American Counseling Association, the American Psychological Association, our professional organizations, and kind of pushing for it. I think if enough of us are pushing for it, um, we see some results. The other thing I think is so important is we have such strong research right now. Some of the research coming out of uh, University of Washington, coming out of, I'm thinking of Craig Prattman's work. I'm thinking of Susan Clayton's work. And so many others. We just have just a really great um, base to draw on to say, we can't ignore this. This is something that we now have a basis for to make ecotherapy a best practice in it with partnering with the other issues and the other practices that we do.
Oh, exactly. May it be so. Thank you.
Thanks both. Other questions, comments, sharings?
I just want to say, Patricia, I really enjoyed the book. I really like the foundational pieces in there. And like, I'm not a therapist, and I still saw applications to education settings, to group settings. And so I think there is a lot there that's broader than the traditional therapeutic lens. And for that, I thank you. I learned lots. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that, Carol. And I'm glad you said that because I do think people who are educators, people who are working with kids, there are ideas in there of how they might utilize some of these exercises and just have these awarenesses and even the language to talk with folks about the human nature relationship. Um, One of the people that read the book and wrote an endorsement for me was uh, Florence Williams, and she made the comment that it seems like it's a book for all of us right now, and I really appreciated that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that I'll throw in my gratitude to Patricia. I think that as someone who is a therapist and also tries to bring nature into my practice, like this book provides, some anchoring and some grounding and inspiration for that. So I
I'm so
appreciate
glad.
it as well. Yeah,
Thank you for saying that. I'm really appreciative.
you're welcome. And actually, we've just had Travis raise his hand. So Travis, if you want to unmute and make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much, Patricia. This is really interesting.
Mhm.
I'm curious. I mean, if ecotherapy, the goal is to help people by greater connecting them to nature. You mentioned this already, but with things like climate grief and eco-anxiety, if nature is the source of that grief, can you talk a little bit about how to help people in those circumstances?
Um, yes, it's one of the studies that I looked at really addressed, they had about roughly 250 people that identified as practitioners or people that were working with eco grief and eco anxiety with folks. And they gave them a whole list of ideas of what they think could be helpful in addressing these topics with the folks they were working with. And exposure to nature or interacting with nature was number one. Um, and I really thought about that in terms of, what is it about that can be very therapeutic in when in fact we're looking at something that we're fearful that we're going to lose. And um, one of the things that comes to mind is this idea of resilience and really looking to nature about how is nature regenerating? What is nature doing? Um, and how can we look at that in terms of our own resilience and our own ideas of what we can do differently? Secondly, I think when we really encourage that interaction with nature, we are also acknowledging people's sense of place and it gives them permission to talk about their grief or their anxiety if there's this idea of loss. Glenn Albrecht's idea of solastalgia, of this idea of homesickness for a place that we're still at home in, but has changed so much. I see that here from results of the fire that happened in 2020. And in talking with, I have a lot of clients that have experienced the same thing. And helping people identify what it is they're experiencing that way, giving them language to do that, I think is very therapeutic. I hope that helps answer the
Yeah,
question.
yeah. I'm pondering. I mean, so I live in Alaska, and I mean, I mean, this place is ground zero for climate change, and you see how much things have changed, and that's very much the sensation. You go out into a place, and you see it's not what it was before, and you know what's coming. And so being in that environment is comforting, but it's also scary because you
Yes.
realize what you're losing. So I guess that's kind of the tension
Yes.
is.
And it can be motivating in terms of getting involved.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of studies that looked at, a large number, like 74%, I think was the number of people who are in the US who are deeply concerned about climate change, but only 59% of them think that other people are as concerned as they are. So there's a lot of isolation that people are experiencing about it. And and perhaps sort of stepping back from getting involved and raising their voice, it promotes that silence that we've seen for a period of time. And I have found that, when I start asking questions about their relationship with nature at the very beginning, at the intake session, just like I would ask about family of origin and weave in a few questions about their relationship with the natural world, it opens up that possibility as a topic that they want to talk about. It makes it okay. It helps to loosen that sense of isolation.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll just add like further to your question, Travis. I understood that there were a couple of people in California trained in forest therapy or forest bathing who had brought folks affected by wildfires out to sites affected by wildfires, and that was really powerful. I think I've read a couple of articles about that. So I mean, I think they convened as a group and they didn't go alone, but they went to these places and there was still something healing about sharing in that grief experience together in those places and on the land. So pretty
Yes.
neat stuff. Anyway,
It can be really powerful. We had, after the fire happened here, we had a small group of neighbors and that we hiked over to where, the fire had really taken away everything. And just had sort of a ritual of time together and sharing of grief. And, um, Joanna Macy used to say you had to open your heart and let it break to be able to work through that grief and that sadness and that tension and release the energy to be able to direct it in ways that are going to be able to address the bigger topics, to free us to energy, to be able to motivate us to to address these topics. And um, I think it was a powerful experience. Ritual can be very healing that way, even something very spontaneous.
Any last burning questions before we wrap up here? We try to honor everyone's time. Yeah, real?
I'm not a clinician, so this might be a little off, but I just wanted to follow up on Travis's question that I'm just wondering if you're in a state of overwhelm, which the world will increasingly be due to climate change, does does it what's the efficacy of this? Like for example, I live in a big city, Toronto, we have nice ravines. I have foxes and rabbits and coyotes running all around us. And I knew it was coming though. Once they like a few dogs get taken away and then the coyotes get euthanized. So how could I'm just thinking that what you're doing could really play an important role in dealing with that. And the response is always we need to educate more, but I think what you're getting to is something a lot deeper.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And um, when the natural world and the wildness of the natural world come up against our urban boundaries, it's too often the natural world doesn't win in those situations, is what I'm hearing you say. And we see that loss of uh, wildness in the environment. And that's where I think it goes back to that ethical question, our ethical responsibility to nature, and just like how much space do we have to take up as a species? How much space do we have to um, uh, infiltrate into wilder spaces? And
Mhm.
I think when we can really, truly, as a society or a large portion of society, deeply acknowledge that we too are nature. We too are a part of the natural world. Then we raise our voices differently. We advocate for the natural world. We advocate for laws and legislation that protects the natural world.
Yeah.
And I do think it's a deeply ethical problem that you're raising.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your question.